Welcome you all to this really fascinating, what I hope will be a fascinating event. Without further ado, Chris, I'm going to jump straight in and ask you a question, perhaps a personal one. Can I ask why you've written this book? Where does your interest in fragility, violence, conflict come from? And we'll continue from there. Huh?
Sure. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you for having me. I guess there's two answers to that question. Partly, I wrote the book because I kept waiting for somebody else to write it, and nobody did. It's a book that I think just tries to bring together decades and decades of work by economists and political scientists and anthropologists and sort of the practical lessons of policymakers. And because I would have all these conversations, I would learn all these things, and I would do my own work in conflict, and all these things I was learning, nobody else seemed to be aware of. It was like a secret that this academic tribe was keeping. So I wanted it to get out there. And as for how I got into it, I won't spoil the surprise because that's the prologue. It does involve me getting conned by two con men in Kenya shortly before I met you. He was not the con man, don't worry. Finding myself in an internet cafe where I met a woman next to me who actually worked in conflict. I'd never thought about it. And let's just say we've been married 15 years. We have several papers together. We also have two kids. And I owe my career because I followed her to a place that made me stop caring so much about economic growth and caring a great deal about violence. And that started the journey.
Thanks for that intro, Chris. And indeed, we do go some way back. What I found really interesting early on in the book is, the title of the book is "Why We Fight." And yet you say that conflict is really the exception rather than the norm. Living in the world we do right now, I mean, especially the last few years, we seem to be seeing a rise in the number of conflicts around the world, the number of people living in conflict-affected areas. Why do you make this big claim that conflict is the exception?
Sure. Two reasons. I mean, the first is, imagine if you were a doctor and you only ever saw terminally ill patients and you didn't realize that the normal state of humanity was health. First of all, you'd be really depressed and demoralized, right? Which is, I think, how a lot of people feel about violence in the world. It just feels like it's everywhere. So that would be unfortunate. But the more important thing is, how good would your doctor be at diagnosis or treatment if they never met anybody who was healthy and they didn't realize people were normally healthy and could get healthy? So I think I wanted people to realize the truth of the matter, because then we diagnose and we treat better. And I think once you point it, I hope, those of you who are going to read the book or walk away tonight, I hope you start to see it everywhere. You'll start to notice, as I did. So 2 weeks into Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there was a New York Times article that you had to scroll through 18 pages of Ukraine news to find, but India accidentally lobbed a cruise missile at Pakistan, and calm ensued, as it has for decades to a large degree, right? The war would have been so unimaginably costly that they strove as hard as possible to avoid it. And children all around the world are going to learn about the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan for the next 2 generations. And none of them will learn about the U.S. invasion of Haiti in 1994. When a dictator seized power, Colin Powell gets sent over to Haiti, shows the dictator a video of American troops with sort of UN support taking off with material and equipment. And he says, "This is not a live feed, this happened 2 hours ago." And the general capitulated right there because fighting wasn't worth it. It almost never is. And the thing is we just don't remember all these quiet moments of compromise, and we pay attention to the moments. We should pay, just like a doctor should pay attention to the terminally ill. It's appropriate, but I think we just have to. The starting point for solving war is just remembering that it's not our natural state.
Thank you, Chris. Important framing. I mean, of course, you know that my first two questions really are teeing you up to try and explain to us this awful conflict that's going on in Ukraine at the moment. How, you know, using the approach that you have in your book, how would you go about explaining why it is then that there is Russia did indeed invade Ukraine? And what explains, you know, how would you explain this?
Yeah. Okay, so I just said wars cost, wars ruinous. This is why they strive not to fight. And so every answer to why we fight is an answer, is a reason that our societies or our leaders ignored those costs. Right? That's just an argument in the book. The book is trying to say, listen, you've heard of a reason for every war and a war for every reason, and all of those might be true. I'm not trying to say believe this theory, other theories are wrong. I'm trying to give you a framework to think through all the theories a little bit more clearly. All right, and so I'll give you all the theories. You can choose to believe which Ukraine-Russia theory you want. I'm going to just give you a framework to think about them. And what I argue in the book is really, I mean, all of these reasons that we ignore the costs of war fit into basically 5 kinds of logics. And they're logics that anybody can understand. So the first one is leaders will ignore many of the costs of war when they're unchecked and unaccountable, because they don't bear the costs and they're not accountable to the people who do. So a personalized dictator is the extreme example of this. Putin bears some costs of war. This is risky for him, to be sure, but he doesn't bear a lot of them. And so that's going to be a major factor, right? And sometimes, I mean, democratic presidents and autocrats can also have private incentives to go to war, to rally people around the flag, potentially stay in power, maybe to exterminate an enemy or a threat, not to your group, but to your individual person or your individual control of power. All right, so unchecked, unaccountable leaders. The second is, I think of as a set of intangible or ideological incentives. Not that you're ignoring the costs of war, but that there's something you get from war that you're willing to pay those costs. So the news is full of stories of Putin either having ambitions of personal glory or a place in history or the next Catherine the Great. There are also stories of his visions of a greater Russia, sort of nationalist visions. All of those are stories of intangible ideological objectives that he holds that make him willing to pay the cost of war that he bears. All right, that's the kind of logic that is. There's a third kind of set of stories that I just sort of put under the label uncertainty. Think of all of the things, how uncertain so many things were 3 months ago. How unified the West would be, not just on sanctions, but on support for Ukraine, on the strength and capabilities of the Russian military, on the strength and resolve of ordinary Ukrainians and the Ukrainian leadership, and so on and so on. And nobody predicted that Russia would get a bad draw on all 3 of these things, I think. Lots of things were in there. There were things could have gone many different ways, right? And so there was a tremendous amount of uncertainty. And so it's possible so war becomes a gamble amidst this uncertainty. There's also a strategic dynamic that goes on, which is to say that when there's uncertainty, the other side has an incentive to bluff, right? Anyone who's played poker in this audience knows that if you don't see the cards that your opponent has, and they seem to be betting aggressively, well, are they bluffing or are they not? And your optimal strategy is not to fold in every circumstance, right? Unfortunately, uncertainty and the opportunity to bluff creates a risk of a call, and a call is a very expensive prospect in this situation. All right, so that's a story of uncertainty. You don't hear that one talked about in the news very much, but I think it's very important. What you do hear talked about in the news a lot is what I call misperceptions. The idea that our leaders are biased. So you also hear the story about Putin where he is either insulated or isolated from information, as many autocrats are. You know, coup-proofing yourself involves some sacrifices in the quality of information you get. Many leaders are also biased to be overconfident and underestimate the costs, right? We wouldn't have a mutual fund management industry if that wasn't true, right? So we know people with high stakes decisions can be super overconfident, and leaders are no exception. Now that biased story sometimes gets mixed up with the uncertainty, right? People think, oh, he got it wrong, he gambled, got a bad draw, that was a miscalculation. Well, that's probably true. I believe these bias stories, the institutional bias and the psychological bias, but I think we can't ignore the true uncertainty. So those are 4 so far why you might ignore costs. And then the 5th is something called a commitment problem. Or you could kind of think about it as you feel your opponent might be unreliable. And both Ukraine and Russia have this challenge in this. So Ukraine, in a world, imagine there's a world where Ukraine thinks, well, perhaps we can offer something to Russia. Can they be confident that Russia will be satisfied with that and then not consolidate itself and continue to ask for more and slice off little bits like pieces of salami? Right? Likewise, Russia wants Ukraine to commit to a deal where they perhaps get some deal, something like semi-sovereignty, not quite democratic, not acquiring new weapons, right? And that's very difficult for the Ukrainian government to agree to, if only because the Ukrainians potentially would toss out any leader that agreed to such a deal. And so there is a deal to be made because they both like to avoid the costs of war, but neither side can trust the other to abide by that deal, right? And that's a set of problems that many political scientists, whether it's World War I, World War II, the US invasion of Iraq, or this war, all plays a role, but we understand the least. So in some sense, like those, so the whole book is about, the first half of the book is about these 5 reasons and how they explain wars at so many levels, and I think they help us categorize these stories about Ukraine, and then it's up to each one of us to decide which ones we think are instrumental or not in this case.
Thank you, Chris. I found the framing quite persuasive in terms of explaining most conflicts. Let's move to the second half of the book, which is where you lay out actually, your 10 commandments. Huh? Mm-hmm. Can you say a little bit, maybe bringing it home to us also, how we should interpret these commandments here at the IMF? Huh? We work with a lot of countries which are in difficult circumstances, outright conflict in many cases. How would you translate? How would you want us to? What would you want us to take away from those 10 commandments? Huh?
Sure. So the second half of the book is the paths to peace, and it's actually about how we have a lot of solutions. We have a lot of things that work at the city level, at the Civil War level, at the international level, and when they work, it's because they attack one of these 5 reasons, right? So mediators are solving uncertainty and misperceptions, and peacekeepers are solving problems of commitment and misperceptions, and sanctions are checking unchecked leaders and intangible incentives, and so forth. And I go through all of the things that we have and why we have a more peaceful world. And then having done that, the problem with writing a book is you have to write a last chapter. And most books die in the last chapter, right? Because they do a few things. One is they tell you how the world is marching towards peace and happiness and everything's going to get better, right? Which I'm an optimistic person, but I didn't want to write that kind of book. Other books, one of my very good friends is Bill Easterly, and the last chapter does the opposite. You sort of really feel miserable and pessimistic, and so I didn't want to write that. And then the other books say, here is your 10-step plan to create world peace. If you follow my prescription, we need more peacekeepers and a stronger UN security, blah, 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 blah. I couldn't write that book either. And so I didn't know what to do. And so I decided, what I realized is that it's a little bit like being a doctor, right? Imagine you went to your doctor and your doctor said, you start to say, well, doc, here's what's bothering me. And he says, Tylenol radiology. And you're like, wait, I didn't even tell you what I was sick with. He's like, doesn't matter. Tylenol radiology covers a lot of bases. And that's actually what a lot of peace building assistance is. US cities, that's how we approach. Well, let's do what New York did. We'll do focused deterrence and stop and frisk, and that'll work. Tylenol and radiology. You have a civil war in Africa. Oh, let's do, first we'll do our demobilization program, a mediator, peacekeepers, a truth and reconciliation commission, and then elections within 3 years, right? That's just Tylenol and radiation. And that doesn't work because not every illness is the same, right? You have to diagnose it, and so every treatment has to be different. So solving conflict is a complex problem. So I actually just spent 2 years reading, and then teaching about all of the social science on how people who've actually studied how you solve complex problems, like what makes good policy, what makes bad policy. And an idea that's at the core of all these great scholars goes back to Karl Popper, the philosopher of science, who talked about piecemeal engineering, that progress is made piecemeal, that we have scientific progress and medical progress and social progress, because rather than take huge steps and prescribe everyone Tylenol and radiology, there's a slow process of informal trial and error. And so the last chapter is called Piecemeal Engineering, but I spell it P-E-A-C-E, which is my cute little. I'd make T-shirts if I thought anyone would buy them. And so the commandments are just about how to. Basically, the commandments are a set of ways to be humble tinkerers, and to recognize that actually something as big as peace actually does happen piecemeal, and it's the only way it ever has. I figured I could get that mucky because nobody ever reached the end of the book. So if somebody actually gets to the last chapter, I know I've got you, and I can we can get into the weeds a little bit. So that's what I do.
Thank you, Chris. Really, very, very nice framing of the book. By the way, beyond these insights, the book is really, really extremely readable. So it's easy to get to the end of the book. Huh? So, if I may, Frank, I want to turn to you now. So, last month our board approved a new fragile and conflict strategy in terms of how we would work with fragile countries and conflict-affected states. Two-part question for you, Frank. I mean, first is, can you please explain the genesis of this, why we needed such an approach here at the fund? I mean, you've been working on this at the bank, of course, and been thinking about these issues for a while. So if you could say a little bit about why we needed to have you here and why we needed to do work here at the fund. And then the second one is, what were your key takeaways from Chris's book? And, how will it inform our work going forward?
Great. Well, thanks. I'll be very happy to be here, and especially for this book, which I also enjoy a lot. Actually, I have to say I cheated a bit because I started with the 10 Commandments. So I started by the end. And it does resonate a lot, actually, the whole point that you made about humility, but I will come back to it. So, Abe, well, why is the fund focusing on countries that are impacted by fragility and conflict? So here, I think I don't have exactly the same opinion than Chris will have. I'm trying to get a little bit excitement on this panel. I mean, I'm not so sure that we live in a more peaceful planet. When you look at, the numbers, violent conflicts is at the 30-level high. You have 90, especially with the war in Ukraine, 1 million people that are forcibly displaced, counting IDPs, refugees. And if you even, I think, which is more complicated over the past years, the type of conflict, and I think you make some hints in your book, which I think is excellent, is that the type of conflicts is much more complex. First, it's not a low-income story. It's also middle income, okay? Let's look at Iraq, let's look at Syria, and so on. Secondly, it's not anymore the classic war between states. It's also interstates with much more violent extremism. And more importantly, it's also recognizing that all the different trends, you look at demographic, you look at climate change, obviously they are not the factor. However, they are exacerbating. So why is the fund stepping up its approach in supporting those countries? Well, first, because unfortunately it's not going in the right direction. Secondly, it's because fragile and conflict-affected states, the way that we look at those countries, hold about 1 billion people. And business as usual, looking at the forecast, means that by 2030, 60% of global poor will be in those countries. Now, the fund, like many other international organizations, has a key role to play. I mean, the whole link, which you make again excellently in an excellent manner, Chris, in your book, between the link between macroeconomic stability and peace, and that's clear. And the whole point about the strategy is to say, how can we leverage all the engagement of the fund supporting those countries? It's not starting today. It has been decades under your leadership, Albé, and all your predecessors in Africa, but also in MCD and other departments. How can we look at the unique challenge that those countries are facing? And that's what I like again about the book, if I may. I'm putting together the two questions. It's complex. It's not easy. And humility is important. So the whole strategy is about first saying every fragile country is different. And there is not a single solution, which I think you make very clearly. It's about looking at much more the political economy analysis, looking at the key drivers of fragility, and recognizing that all analysis has its own bias, which you make again. The whole aid is political, and very carefully about looking about the bias that you may want to introduce. What does that mean for the fund? It means that, for instance, in fragile and conflict-affected states, we are looking at what we call country engagement strategy, focusing on the key drivers of fragility at the level of the country. So looking at all the constraints the country is facing, not talking only about lack of capacity, but more about all the key issues in terms of governance, in terms of horizontal inequalities, about lack of social contract, trust in the institution, lack of legitimacy. And the whole point, which Abe keeps on making rightly within the fund, is to say, and so what? What does that mean for our engagement? Are we supporting this country the same way that you support more stable countries? The response is no. We had actually an internal review assessment done about a few years ago about the fund's work in those countries, which was very clear. The fund is playing a key role in supporting those countries, building macroeconomic institutions, for instance, which is so important for peace and stability. But at the same time, support has to be calibrated. Support has to be tailored. The way you provide capacity development is different in Central African Republic than in another more stable country. It's not too much about what needs to be done, it's about how to do it. It's about involving more staff from the ground than from Washington, D.C. But it's also about tailoring our engagement, looking at conditionalities and their impact in terms of distributive policies. So basically the strategy is leveraging the engagement of the fund for many years in those countries, recognizing that they represent 20% of our membership. It's significant, it's important. They are the most vulnerable countries, by the way, impacted by COVID like no other group of countries, and also impacted, by the way, by the spillover of the war in Ukraine. Look at the whole food security crisis that we're seeing today. And the whole point about the strategy is to say, how can we step up our engagement by better tailoring our support, but also with a keyword of humility, recognizing that macroeconomic policies are important, but let's be super clear. We are just one actor among many others, political, security, military actors, and we should be very clear about it. Now, it's not a reason for not stepping up and not do our part and trying to do it in a more tailored manner, and that's what the strategy is about. On the book, I think, Chris, I really enjoy it as well. I think there are many points about, first, managing expectation. Getting out of fragility is not an espresso machine delivery. It's not overnight. It takes decades. Humility, as I said, recognizing that we need to partner with humanitarian peace security actors, basically organizations that don't necessarily talk with each other and have different mandates. I mean, the way that we are working, for instance, in dealing with refugee crisis is by engaging with UNHCR. We work with the Red Cross. I'm talking about the IMF. We worked with peace security actors. Why? Because they are bringing this intelligence, this granularity, which is so much needed, and which would be completely different in Papua New Guinea, in Yemen, or in Libya. And I think that's exactly your point about saying, this is complex. Please be very careful about not bringing your solution from Washington, D.C., but more about recognizing that each country, fragile country, is fragile in its own way. So let me stop here, but obviously the 10 Commandments, but also looking at the notion of incentives, I think is very appealing, trying to see about what are the grievances between different groups of the society so that you can actually provide support according to your own mandate, which is actually a key point of your book.
Thank you so much, Frank. I mean, just as a follow-up, Chris, to the points Frank was making, there is, would you agree with this point that the number of conflicts has been actually going up over time? I mean, of course, you know, it depends when you start this time clock. I mean, you know, we all know the story about life I don't know, before the 19th century or whatever, being short, brutish, and
Right. I mean, I didn't write a book called Why We Don't Fight.
yeah.
Right. So obviously we fight. And I spent my lifetime, so it's more, I don't want to overstate this, and I think it's too common. I think it's worth noting that most of these wars are relatively low intensity wars, precisely because war is costly. So wars, when they break out, tend to either be short or tend to be low intensity because the alternative is gruesome. That doesn't make them any easier to solve and no less important. So we all have to think of ourselves as we have to pay attention to the critically ill patients. I have a question for you. I mean, one of the things I learned in the book, and in the process of just in my career, came from a mentor of mine is someone named Amos Sawyer, who's a political scientist and an activist from Liberia, who accidentally somewhat became president of Liberia when Charles Taylor, the warlord, took most of Liberia in 1989. Political parties met in exile and nominated this quiet, principled, and very gentle academic to be president, basically of Monrovia. And he wrote about his experience afterwards. And the drum he beat before and after that for the rest of his life, he sadly passed away last month, was that the fundamental problem of conflict was centralization of power in executives, which is a particular feature of African countries, and which is part of your portfolio. And there's going to be a question here. Don't worry. And that makes sense. It makes sense through these 5 causes that not only are these unchecked leaders ignoring the costs, but then we're vulnerable to their ideological incentives. We're vulnerable to their biases and misperceptions. It's very uncertain what's going on in the minds of these leaders, and then dictators find it really hard to make credible commitments. So there's all sorts of commitment problems. And his issue with international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank was that and the whole UN system and sovereign system actually accentuates this problem of centralized power, because you can't lend money to the mayor of Kampala, right? And you can't even go to, I don't think you can't go to the devolved, budgetary committees and regional leaders in Kenya or Nigeria, right? And so all of this pipeline of cash, whether it's loans or aid, goes through the president. And so he didn't know how to, I don't know how to make that better. He didn't know how to make that better. I mean, this is, on the margin, are there ways for the IMF and the World Bank, for international financial institutions to not be a force for such centralized power that unchecks our leaders and actually, I think, contributes to instability? Or is that, are hands tied by international law? In a way that
Putting me on the spot,
fired from your job tomorrow.
It's end of the day here, so I was hoping to have an easier ride and ask you guys questions. But I think there's some valid points there. Huh? But a couple of thoughts perhaps. I think the first one is I started, finished grad school, started work in the early 90s and moved to Addis, to my home country about that time. And I would say kind of in my history, in my experience of living in Africa from the 80s to 90s, one of the big things that has happened, of course, is that we've moved from a lot of unconstrained leaders to way more constrained leaders. I mean, I think that's what the whole democratic wave in the early 90s was about. And if you ask me, kind of, and from my understanding of recent African economic history, we have a lot of leaders that are way more constrained than we did in the 80s and 70s and periods before. By no means is democracy perfect. By no means is there full accountability, nor political institutions as strong as they ought to be. But I think we are in a much, much better place than we were before. And again, I don't want to be sitting here making excuses for all the shortcomings. But if you think about how quickly this has happened, post colonization, I think it's not a trivial shift. So governments are more constrained, or leaders are more constrained. Second point I would make is, I think the response of institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and others has been to push for, more say by parliaments in budget processes, for example. So when we talk to governments, we want to understand fiscal policy. We understand fiscal policy as approved by budgets. If they want to revise that, we ask for a supplementary budget. So as much as possible to get bigger ownership. And really, though, where we make by far the biggest difference in terms of promoting accountability is in the work we do in facilitating, strengthening institutions. So central banks, revenue authorities, but importantly, public finance management type work. So we try and get as much information about how government resources are being used out there as possible. And this actually over the years has gone on steroids, frankly. I mean, and even raises some questions about, how interfering we're becoming in deeply political processes. But I think that's how we've tried to guard against that. Then maybe one other thought is, one thing that really also worries me is we tend to demonize African governments and African states. I have to tell you, I've been in this institution many years now and worked around, the world here, from Asia to a little bit to Latin America, Caribbean, a lot in Europe, and of course in my beloved continent. And I have to say, kind of, we underestimate just how effective relative to the limited resources, not financial, but human capital, political constraints, the initial conditions, and who would be an African Minister of Finance, or who would be, it's amazing how many constraints they have to manage, and they do their level best 90% of the time to move the development agenda forward. So those are my thoughts for what they're worth. I don't know, Frank, do you want to weigh in?
I think the international community has actually changed a little bit the approach over the past years, because the whole point is to say you work with states that are in some case part of conflict. That's the number one issue. I think the whole point is that you may have seen from the World Bank, many multilateral development banks, the whole point is to say we need to have a deeper understanding of the political economy, deeper understanding and deeper focus on exactly what you said, Abe, accountability of institutions, and making sure that we are looking at what I mentioned, the key drivers of fragility. In fact, the World Bank focus on fragile and conflict-affected states is precisely to look at the key drivers of fragility and look about how does that impact development support. So the whole citizen engagement, social accountability, making sure that we just don't look at service provision, but more about state legitimacy and the way services are being provided. I think you will see that over the past few years, the whole international community has actually shifted by breaking some silo, working more with humanitarian, peace, security actors, but bringing more what you have in your book, the whole political economy analysis, incentive, and looking at grievances. And I think that's kind of important. So I just wanted to point out.
So, in about 5-10 minutes, I have a couple more questions for Chris. I'll open the floor for questions from the floor. So this would be a good time to think of your questions. So, Chris, just as Frank was talking about, governmental legitimacy, one of the big challenges clearly in the region, and touches on the question you asked me, also is like how to strengthen the social contract, right? How to promote accountability beyond, in various ways. And you have this nugget here, I thought, where you talk about in the US, the creation of the Continental Congress, and why the members of this Congress were able, felt free to speak up more volubly, having to do with the fact that they had, a lot of autonomy, a lot of agency, because they owned land and so on. If is that what is missing in Africa or other countries where there isn't as much legitimacy in parliamentarians or ability to push back against leaders, that perhaps we've not been thinking deeply enough about how to strengthen the legitimacy of the people that are there to constrain the executive.
I think that going back to this era of America, I think this idea of checks and balances is fundamental. I think actually we too quickly, the progress towards democracy in elections for president and legislatures in Africa is incredible. I think we tend to, Claude Ake, who's a Nigerian political scientist, though, he called that the trivialization of democracy. Because it's not just about electing your leaders, it's about the division of power across branches of government. It's about independent bureaucracies, which is part of what you mentioned. It's about not just regional politicians, but those who actually have the power to tax and spend, which is really what matters. It's also about checks and balances can come from above. It can come from the union of the states, right? Or an East African Union, or a Mano River Basin Union in West Africa, or the European Union, treaties, World Trade Organization. All of these are ways of binding the hands of rulers, not just downwards through accountability, but laterally and upwards. And that, I think, was the crucial thing that James Madison and Hamilton and Adams had figured out. And the problem is, like, a personalized ruler, even the ideal personalized elected ruler, like Ellen Johnson Sirleaf when she was president of Liberia, who's maybe one of the most unchecked, elected, but once you're in power, appoint every mayor, appoint every judge, a weak legislature, didn't want to give up any power. And so I don't know the answer to that. I think it might begin, like you said, I think maybe interest groups being able to check the executive is part of that, and strong industrialists and a broader economic base would be, to me, the biggest prospect. I think any effort towards an African, very seldom will we see devolution, I think, within a lot of these countries. They're already quite small, right? But you could get effective devolution if they were empowered, if the East African Union happens and there's real budgetary authority at that level, right? That to me would be a really important check and balance. So any movement in that direction, which has to be the decision of these countries, I think would be moving in the right direction. But so to me, the conversation has to be less about democracy and more about checks and balances.
So just to be clear, when I was talking about democracy, maybe I should have brought in, both electoral democracy, but I think also really executives are more constrained than they were. Again, the shift from Charles Taylor to,
the quality of African governance has increased at a faster rate than the quality of European governance did over most of its history. Like, it's been very rapid catch-up. I think it's but there's nothing wrong with, I'm just saying, let's not steer them in the opposite direction.
Oh, far from it. I think, and just though, it's also important that this is more of a bottom-up process rather than, and one of the great pleasures, I have to say, over the years for me of engaging on and off with African countries is just how much stronger both the, continent-wide institution, but also smaller, regional ones is. So East African communities, relative to 10 years, it's a much, much more functional body. ECOWAS, WAEMU, CEMAC, they have Council of Ministers meeting, they hold each other accountable, talk to each other. So
absolutely,
there has been progress. About ECOWAS's role in tamping down, of course, coups until recently.
Exactly.
Right? And
I think it's been very, very important.